more about how poverty impacts the brain can be really substantial in terms of those of us who are working with folks who are actively living in poverty or who have in the past. So we're going to talk about some of the brain things as it relates to poverty, and then just some other data and statistics. And as Hillary mentioned, we're going to do a session next week that is focused a little bit more, singularly on poverty, the brain, and teen pregnancy. So this is going to be more of a macro conversation around poverty and how it impacts the brain. So why should this all matter to all of us? So I've already talked about this idea of economic mobility, and that it is, for a lot of people, hard to move up the income ladder if they have started at the bottom, essentially started with living in poverty. So that, is this macro thing that we can talk about, that poverty physically impacts the brain. We're going to talk at length about that in just a few minutes, about how poverty impacts the brain. But since most of you are coming from West Virginia, I know not all of you are, but I think most of you are, I wanted to talk about what poverty looks like in West Virginia. And most of you probably already know this, but I think it's important to talk about. So obviously, I've never been to West Virginia, as I told you, so I had to do some research on what poverty looks like in West Virginia. So this is, from some research. Specifically, I pulled this from the West Virginia Policy.org website, and some of you may have potentially seen this before, but West Virginia has some pretty high rates of poverty, and specifically, this data is from 2018, so not a long time ago. And West Virginia is the 4th highest in the country for a total poverty rate, and that rate is at 17.8. So you'll see that here on this first bar of the bar chart. And what I think is potentially concerning for those of us on this call, because it seems like from the feedback here, while not all of you work with young people, a good bit of you do work with young people. So what's really concerning is this, right, is the children living in poverty. I hope that you can see my mouse there, but 24% of the young people in West Virginia are living in poverty, and that is the 6th highest child poverty rate in the 50 states, again in 2008. And so we've got a lot of young people, and the rate of young people living in poverty is pretty high. And so we're going to talk specifically about young people over the course of this presentation. And we're going to talk about why, even if a young person lived in poverty growing up and no longer lives in poverty now, how that still impacts them. But I just wanted to make sure that you all kind of had a centering of the fact that poverty is an issue in West Virginia. So there are several different types of poverty, and I also just want to define poverty. And there are going to be several things that I reference specifically from this book, and I pulled it out so I can show it to you. It is called Teaching with Poverty in Mind, and as you can tell, I've flagged this book. I've got highlighted notes and things page flagged, but this is by Eric Jensen, who has just done so much work around. Somebody loves it. Yes, Amanda, I just love this book so much. If you have not heard of Eric Jensen, look him up, get this book. He's got several other books. He's got one that's called Teaching with Poverty in Mind. He's got one that I've got over here, Arts with the Brain in Mind. He's got a newer book that has some very practical strategies. So I've got several of his books, and his work is really great. But I will reference his work and this book and his research several times throughout this presentation, and this is one of them. So I really like his definition of poverty, and so I'm going to read it straight from the screen here. He defines poverty from his research as a chronic and debilitating condition that results from multiple adverse synergistic risk factors and affects the mind, body, and soul. So what I really like about Eric Jensen's definition is that it tells the story that poverty is more than one thing. It is more than just a financial issue. It is more than just one thing. To Jason's point, it's a very holistic definition. Additionally, I think it's important to note that poverty impacts everything about a person. So it is not just their ability to pay their rent on time or to be able to go to the grocery store and not have to stress about how much money they're going to spend. It impacts every single thing about what they do. So there are different types of poverty, and I'll skim over most of them, but I think, again, this language is really important for us to know. So there's situational poverty, and again, this comes straight from Eric Jensen's work, is generally caused by some sort of sudden crisis or loss, and is often temporary, right? And so if one, big thing happens, it can sometimes push families into situational poverty, but it does not have to be a long-term situation. Generational poverty is what my family experienced up until, me and some of my cousins, where specifically Eric Jensen says that at least 2 generations have been born into poverty. And based on the research that I've done about West Virginia, I would imagine that you all have some families who have experienced generational poverty as well. Absolute poverty is rare in the United States, and it includes scarcity of necessity. So we're talking about shelter, running water, and food, things like that. Relative poverty refers to the economic status of a family whose income is insufficient to meet the society's average standard of living. Urban poverty is what is experienced where I live, and that is where you've got a more metropolitan area, and so the poverty looks a little bit different. But rural poverty, and again, based on our research, so you all are going to have potentially a mix of all of these things, or a mix of urban and rural poverty. But from my understanding of the research I've done about West Virginia, it seems like you have more rural poverty. And that's occurring in non-metropolitan areas, and that is where there are more single guardian households. There are often families who have less access to services, less access to support for disabilities and quality educational opportunities. And there are programs to encourage transition from welfare to work in more remote rural areas. And so again, just understanding that there are different types of poverty, and that poverty is this very holistic thing that impacts individuals and families. So we're going to talk first about some of the effects of poverty before we talk specifically about how poverty impacts the brain. And the 4 things on the language is from this book, and then you'll see that there's a graph from Scientific American. So there are 4 primary risk factors that are afflicting families who live in poverty. So there are emotional and social challenges, acute and chronic stressors, cognitive lags, and health and safety issues. So there's the emotional and social issues that there's an emotional burden for a lot of families who are living in poverty, and they're often related to acute and chronic stressors. We're going to talk, when we talk about the brain, we're going to talk about emotions and where they live in the brain, and it'll kind of hit a little bit more on some of the emotional challenges associated with living in poverty. All of us are acutely aware of what stress feels like, particularly now, kind of in the middle of a global pandemic, but we all know what stress feels like mentally and physically. And a little bit of stress is actually good for our brains and our body. It basically puts our body into overdrive to allow us to deal with whatever the stressor is. But when stress is consistent and lasts over an extended period of time, that stress becomes chronic stress. It is also referred to as toxic stress because it's not a good thing for our bodies, and it can have lasting health implications and health challenges. The increased levels of cortisol, for example, which is a stress-related hormone, it can make us sick. It can lead to things like diabetes and high blood pressure, and so that chronic stress can be really problematic. Cognitive lags. So many of you are working in the K through 12 education space, and so you are very likely seeing this. And in several slides, we're going to talk more about the specifics of some of those cognitive lags and what our young people in poverty are experiencing from an academic standpoint. But you can also see on this slide here, and this is from Scientific American, that we've just got essentially the way that this graph is shown is that all of those blue dots are students who participated in the survey, right? And then this line here is essentially is the direct relationship between socioeconomic status and test scores. So essentially what this graph is telling us is that the more money a family has, the better those young people do on academic tests. And the better that those young people are doing in terms of short-term memory, which we'll talk very specifically about that in a little bit, cognitive control, memory of facts and events, and language skills, and all of these things we'll talk a little bit more about, because these kind of show up in multiple places in terms of the literature. So we've got young people who are academically behind, and oftentimes they are behind, and it only gets essentially worse, and they get further behind. And then there are health and safety issues. Again, we'll talk some more about that later, but there are those health issues, sometimes from that chronic stress that I mentioned, those increased levels of cortisol that are just not great for our brains and body. There's also an issue of things like underinsured folks that don't have insurance. Low-income people are less likely to have a primary care physician, and all of this data is from when I worked at the hospital. They're less likely to go to regular appointments for all kinds of reasons. A lot of it is they are busy with other things and busy with working and trying to take care of kids and, you know, managing a lot of things, but, you know, they're less likely to have regular doctor's appointments. They're more likely to utilize the emergency room, the emergency department, again, as opposed to having a primary care physician. And so there are just these health challenges that can come in addition to some safety issues associated oftentimes with the neighborhood in which a lot of low-income folks live. So again, this goes back to that point that Eric Jensen talks about, that poverty is very holistic and that poverty impacts a variety of things within an individual person's life. So on to the next slide. So I'm going to get very nerdy here and get all into the brain science. So because it seems like a good bit of you also are working with young people, again, in that K through 12 space, I'm going to talk a little bit about general brain development in terms of, you know, the brain development of teenagers, and then I'm also going to talk about how poverty impacts the brain. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to try to go slow because to me, it's like all these things I know, but for people who've never heard of these things, it takes a little bit longer. So what we're going to do is go through each of the following, the 3 points that have an arrow here. So we're going to go through those, talk about, you know, their function and what development should look like for young people. Then we're going to cycle back and talk about how poverty impacts those very specific parts of the brain. So again, I hope that you can see my mouse, but we're going to start with the amygdala, which is here in the bottom left-hand corner. And this is just an image of the brain. But so the amygdala is, oh my gosh, it's such a fascinating part of the brain. So most of you have either heard the term amygdala or you know about it even if you're not fully aware of it. So most people in my experience have heard of the fight or flight response, the fight, flight, or freeze response. And that is when there is a threatening thing that happens to us, our brain incredibly quickly, within milliseconds, decides how to engage. We're either going to fight, we're going to freeze because we are terrified and don't know what else to do, or more likely, we're going to get the heck out of there, right? So most of the time, it's going to be a fight or fight response, but sometimes it will be a freeze response. That is rooted in the amygdala. The amygdala is deep in our brain and our limbic system, and it is responsible for much of our unconscious activity. Much of what our brain is doing on a regular basis is unconscious, which is honestly a good thing. You know, we don't want to have to consciously think about things like breathing or, making sure that our body runs. And there's so many times where we are on autopilot and don't think about it. I know for me, there are times when I'm brushing my teeth and I'm not really thinking about it. It's just kind of something that I do, without really thinking about it. A lot of times this will happen where you'll drive to work and you will get to work and say, I don't remember that drive, right? Your unconscious brain just took over because you've done it 100 times. And so you can just do it without even necessarily having to think about it. So again, our amygdala controls that part of our brain. Our amygdala also, because it is that threat response, it can take over the rest of our brain very, very quickly. And so again, within milliseconds, when there is a threat happening or something that is incredibly terrifying for us, our amygdala takes over. And it essentially tells the rest of our brain what to do. And it tells, our feet and our legs to walk faster, to run, right? It's going to tell our adrenaline to increase. It just fully takes over all of our brain and all of our body. And again, it happens incredibly quickly. And we're not fully conscious of it because it happens so incredibly quickly. So, our amygdala is just basically, our primary spot within our brain that is focused on keeping us safe. It's kind of like a little guard outside of a castle or a palace, trying to just watch everything around and say, is this safe? Am I safe? And if we are not safe, the amygdala is going to act incredibly, incredibly quickly. So that's the amygdala. It's important to note that the way that the brain really starts to develop, it develops like a muscle. So while all of our brain obviously is there when we're born, it develops over time. So much of our brain development happens within the first 3 to 5 years of life. And so I know some of you all, I wrote down what you all are doing, but I know some of you all are working in the preschool space, early childhood space, and you all are really interacting with young people where so much of their brain development happens. So you all are so critical in terms of brain development. But our young people, our teenagers, I work primarily with teenagers in my volunteer and in my work life. Their amygdalas are fully developed. And in about a minute or so, you're going to fully understand why that's important. But we've got young people whose amygdalas are fully developed. And again, that is the part of the brain that just kind of makes us act because it is constantly observing and trying to make sure that we're safe. So it's the amygdala. Right next to it, and then the arrow is on the bottom right-hand side, is the hippocampus. And they, if you notice, are very, very close together. The hippocampus is really our kind of memory storage space. So it is kind of our filter. We input information, and our hippocampus decides, is this short-term memory that we don't really need? We can probably, throw that away. Is this information that we're going to need in a long-term capacity? Okay, great, we're going to keep this and we're going to store it. The amygdala and hippocampus often work together because the amygdala, going back to that, is where we store and we connect emotions to very intense memories. So, you probably know exactly where you were when you heard about the terrorist attacks on 9/11. I remember exactly where I was, right? I don't remember all of the details of the day, but I remember where I was in different parts of the day, right? If you have gotten married, you probably can think about your wedding and have all of these positive emotions. At least I hope that they're positive. If there is a scent that really matters to you from your childhood, and you smell that, you're going to have a flurry of memories and emotions associated with that. And again, that's because of that relationship between the hippocampus and the amygdala, which we'll talk about again in just a second. So we're going to round out to the prefrontal cortex, which is arguably my very favorite part of the brain. That's right here behind our forehead. That part of the brain does not finish developing until our early 20s, right? So the strength of that, think of it again like a muscle, the strength of that muscle does not finish developing until our early 20s. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for the executive functioning of the brain, right? It's kind of like the boss of the brain. It is responsible for things like thinking into the future, organizing, long-term planning. It is kind of the part of our brain that kind of helps us think and helps us make nuanced decisions. And it is the part of our brain that makes us kind of look around and say, I think this makes sense. I'm not really sure. I think this makes sense. I'm not really sure. So again, it's significantly more nuanced, and it is responsible for a lot of those executive functioning and essentially the part of our brain that makes us adults and the part of our brain that separates us from all other mammals, right? So again, it's often my favorite part of the brain. And I certainly, goodness knows, I use it a lot. So when we're talking about teens specifically, and I work with teenagers, and they sometimes will drive you crazy. And the reason why teenagers will sometimes drive you crazy is because they have amygdalas that are fully developed, which can make them feel like they are spontaneous. Because the part of the brain that is programmed and created to make us say, stop, wait a minute, I should really think about this decision, and I really need to decide if this is the best course of action. That part of the brain is not developed yet. So we've got teenagers who are ready to go, right? And we haven't talked about hormones, right? And they are just going to act without the part of the brain that is programmed for them to stop and think and calm down and plan into the future. That part of the brain is just not there yet. Right? So that's a little bit of just kind of teenage information for you. So if you've got a teenager, I'm going to encourage you to be patient with them, but tell them to meditate because it can help calm down their amygdala and help with their prefrontal cortex, which we will talk about that again in a second. So those are the three parts of the brain. Now we're going to circle back and talk about how poverty impacts those three parts of the brain. What I want to make sure is that you all understand is that this is primarily for people for whom they have lived in poverty for just extended amounts of time. So i.e. like my dad, who lived in poverty until he was essentially about 20, 21. Young people who lived in poverty during critical developmental stages, so that is pre-birth to age 5, and that's also some other kind of developmental stages and those transitions, so like 5th, 6th grade, 8th to 9th grade, that sort of thing. And it can even potentially, some of these impacts, which we'll understand in just a second, can also happen if young people experience poverty within their teenage years. Okay, so circling back to the amygdala. For folks who live in poverty, their amygdala is larger and more attuned to environmental threats. So here's what that means in day-to-day life. So the amygdala, again, fight, flight, or freeze, threat response. I didn't also mention that while not exclusively negative emotions, which I don't always tell kids negative or positive, but the emotions that we don't love as much, while they are, that we also have positive emotions that kind of live in our amygdala, negative emotions live more primarily in our amygdala. So I didn't even mention that. So all of those things are, remember that's in our amygdala. And so when we've got larger amygdalas, and the amygdala is already kind of that guard of the palace, saying what's happening, what's going on. And because it is more attuned to environmental threats, it is just even more hyper and intense and on guard. And things that may or may not feel like a threat to you or I, for somebody who has lived in poverty and grown up in poverty, it is easier for something to feel like a threat. It's also important to know that at our core, we have a biological need to belong and to be in community with other people. And so it's basically a recipe for disaster if you've got a young person who's in middle or high school living in poverty, because if you've ever worked with middle or high school students, you are wildly aware that they click up, developmental part of the brain, and that they click out and get mad at each other all of the time, right? And so for someone who's got a larger amygdala, you know, my friend not calling me back or not texting me back can feel incredibly intense, even if for that friend, it doesn't feel intense. Another just interesting part of the brain is that the part of the brain that processes pain does not always understand the difference between physical pain and social pain. So that particularly emotional pain related to social interactions. And so there are times where there's a social pain that we feel as intensely as as a physical pain. So that idea of like, you know, I'm heartbroken and I can feel it. There's actually some science to support that. So again, we've got, you know, folks who are living in poverty with larger amygdalas, and they're more, you know, they're just more attuned to threats, and things that may not feel like threats to us can absolutely feel like a threat to someone who's living in poverty. We're going to jump to the hippocampus. Because the amygdala is bigger, needs a little bit more room, that's going to impact the hippocampus. So for our young people, and again, our adults who are, you know, who've lived in poverty, that hippocampus is just smaller. So these folks are going to struggle with short-term memory. They're potentially going to struggle with long-term memory because their hippocampus is impacted, right? Now let's go over to the prefrontal cortex. So I've already told you, in the best of circumstances, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until our early to mid-20s, right? And the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that essentially makes us adults, responsible for executive functioning, planning, thinking, judgment, all of those things. Well, for folks who have grown up in poverty, and what's fascinating and sometimes a bit concerning is, without any sort of intervention, even if I've lived in poverty from 0 to 6 and I'm not living in poverty anymore, I can potentially still have these impacts on my prefrontal cortex, even though that development doesn't finish until our early 20s without intervention. That's the thing to remember. So what happens for folks who are living in poverty is that their prefrontal cortex is less thick and has less gray matter. What that means is that essentially that muscle, that prefrontal cortex muscle, is just not as strong, right? And so in an ideal world, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are communicating and have a very strong relationship. And so when there's a threat that's happening, hopefully in an ideal world, our prefrontal cortex engages quickly enough to say, whoa, that's actually not a threat. Calm down. That's not a tiger. That's not a bear. You're not going to hit somebody, you know, with your car. That's not an actual threat. Calm down. And your amygdala going to say, okay, everybody relax. Everybody calm down. You know, I have this image, and it's because I work so much with young people, and I just like Disney, but I have an image of a castle and a guard, and the guard saying, okay, it's okay, guys, we're fine, right? That is when that relationship is tight and good. when the relationship isn't good. The amygdala is going to perceive a threat, again, a threat that may or may not be one, but it feels like a threat, right? So my teacher is being sarcastic with me. I have a friend who told me that they don't want to be my friend anymore for whatever reason. I have a friend who sat with someone else at the lunch table, right? Some of the other things that you're working with, and whether it is a perceived or a real threat, it's going to feel very intense. So if I'm a young person in foster care and I'm having my placement move completely unexpectedly, right? That is threat. Again, whether it's perceived, it's real, whatever the case may be, my amygdala is on guard. And because my prefrontal cortex is at a minimum not quick enough to intervene, all of the guards in front of the castle are going. Right? My adrenaline is increased. I am potentially either going to fight or I'm going to flee, right? Which is not necessarily a great response, particularly from a young person. My body is going to engage, and I am going to make a decision that I later on may or may not be happy with or may not be proud of. But the part of my brain that is programmed to help me make good decisions is not able to engage. It is somewhere over there like a little infant trying to grow, and it is not yet there, right? So at the core of all of this in terms of the brain science is that when we've got folks who have grown up in poverty and are living in poverty, the way it will present is that they're more spontaneous. It will present like they're not making good decisions. It will present like they're not planning, they're not thinking. And we'll talk in a few slides about what this looks like in a school setting. If you give a young person a project and they forget about it and don't even start it until the night before when you remind them, all of those things. So we've got people who are, making decisions that to us don't make a lot of sense. What I think is really important also to understand, because some of you also work with adults and some of you are working with parents who grew up in poverty, these impacts specifically for folks who are in generational poverty or have lived their entire life in poverty, it doesn't go away when they become an adult. I now joke with my dad because I'm the brain girl, and I'm like, Dad, your amygdala is bigger. Go sit down somewhere and calm down, right? Because even though he's 50, he still has some of these impacts of poverty that have followed him throughout life, because at this point, this is the way that his brain is, right? So we're going to move forward, but again, if at any point you have questions, you can utilize the Q&A function, and we'll go back and talk and answer some questions at the end. So that is the physical impact and manifestation of poverty. So there are some neighborhood and family dynamics. Again, I'm going back to Eric Jensen, and I couldn't really find any research in West Virginia to kind of confirm this. So feel free to utilize the chat function to tell me if these things are true in West Virginia. I know that they are true in the upstate of South Carolina where I live. So there's this macro data, but for me, I know that here, the local data confirms this. But feel free to tell me, no, we don't see this in West Virginia. Yes, we see a lot of this. But in neighborhoods where there are concentrated rates of poverty and where there are families where, a family living in poverty, these things can be true. There are increased levels of both violent and nonviolent crime within, thank you, Margaret, all of it, within that neighborhood. So I think about, the neighborhoods here in the upstate of South Carolina where there's poverty, there are increased rates of violence. There just are, right? There's less green space in neighborhoods, which kind of has two impacts. I have this theory, and I just haven't quite had time to do the research on it, that I have a theory that something happens to us when we are in essentially less aesthetically pleasing places, right? Like there's a reason why we like going to parks where there's greenery and when there's trees, right? Also, it can, impact our ability to just go outside and walk and exercise and that sort of thing. But also, interestingly enough, when there's more pavement and concrete and less green, it's physically hotter, which is just interesting. So they may be in crowded, physically deteriorated housing, and Amy Jo is saying that public housing is crowded. Housing is not affordable and not sufficient. That is 1,000% the story of what's happening in Greenville and really around the country. And I'm going to just respond here on the chat. But I mean, we've got places that the housing is crowded. I mean, we've got multiple people living in one specific house. We've got, there's not a lot of housing options. And so there's something about that, right? If I don't necessarily have the ability, to go sit at the coffee table and do my homework because there's so much going on, how does that impact me? So Amanda's saying in our area of Southern West Virginia, crime is minimal, but drug use is consuming our district. And I did do some research on that drug use is showing up, and we may talk about that as well. So they are more likely to have caregivers in the service industry. So I think it was Amy Jo who talked about that. While she said Walmart is your biggest employer. While it's not exactly the service industry, there can be some overlap. So what the research tells us about having caregivers within the service industry is several things. One, their job is more kind of physically, taxing, if you will. And I will say, if you are a teacher, your job is physically taxing. Like, I did it and it's really hard, but there's that, right? Folks who are working in the service industry in general are more likely to have inconsistent scheduling. They're more likely to have to work nights and weekends. And so then also childcare is going to potentially be an issue. And so there's certainly some of that overlap with Walmart being one of your bigger employers. And they have caregivers who are more likely to be overworked. And so that is both in terms of the actual hours that they are working, but also that physical nature of their work, and also undereducated. And so, those are just, again, important factors to think about. So for example, if you're doing home visits and you need to talk to the mom or the dad or the caregiver who lives there with the teen parent, we may have to get a little creative about when we're having those meetings, because they may be working nights and weekends, right? So I'm just going to quickly read through some of these comments since they're about West Virginia, and I've already told you that, I'm not really sure here. So there's a decay in housing, certainly. There are food deserts. I mean, that is a really important thing that relates to healthcare, and I'll write that down and kind of circle back to that. So affordable and safe housing is a struggle, lots of families doubling up. And then, oh gosh, that's really an important point, Tanya. You all are still overcoming environmental trauma from a flood in the area. And so that, there's some just trauma associated with that in terms of both physical and the environment. There are many home healthcare workers in the area living in low-income houses. Many of your clients, Maureen, try to apply for Social Security, but they are working in service industry jobs, fast food, hotel housekeeping. Many of the kids who live in public housing in Charleston have never been outside of Charleston. Gosh, I mean, that's such a huge, in our area, we've got kids who on our Main Street, downtown Main Street, we have a baseball stadium, and we have low-income students who have never been to the baseball stadium, even though some of them, they live 10 minutes away, right? But it's an access issue. Nearly 62, this is fascinating, Amy, nearly 62% of your children are raised by grandparents, right? And grandparents are amazing, but for some of them, they may have not planned on raising their grandchildren. And so there are certain implications that come along with that, right? They may be tired, they're potentially older, certainly, there may be health challenges. And so, there's a lot to think about. Again, poverty is holistic when we're thinking about the family and neighborhood factors associated with poverty. So I want to talk about the educational environment and specifically talking about young people. But what's important to note is that for some of these things, they're going to follow a young person into adulthood, and we'll still see some of those impacts in adulthood. So children who live in poverty are more likely to rely on their peers for social support, because if I've got a parent who is they're doing the best they can, but they're working, and they're, often working afternoons and nights, and, when they're home, they've got a lot going on because they're trying to make sure that I'm fed and all of that, I may not be able to just sit down with them and for them to ask me about, how my day was, because they're busy. They're trying to make sure that I'm fed and all of those things. So I'm going to rely on someone else for social support, potentially a peer who, if I'm a teenager, my peer probably isn't always going to give me the best advice about what to do. Children who live in poverty and also adults who become adults are less likely to have a range of coping skills. So I do work specifically with low-income teens, and I run a high school graduation program. And we talk a lot about coping skills for stress and anger, because our program wants to teach them, among other things, how to make sure that they're responding to stress and anger in a way that is productive and in a way that allows them to be able to move forward and not get in trouble or kind of sever relationships, that sort of thing. But if I, again, have a parent who, you know, if I've got a parent who is busy doing the best they can, if I've got a grandparent who, you know, is busy doing all kinds of things, and quite frankly, honestly, maybe just tired, right? They may or may not be able to teach me some of those coping skills that I need in order to be successful, right? This third thing, the first time I ever read it, it blew my mind, and for some reason it just continues to. Low-income students, and we see this all the time, they know fewer words, right? They are less likely to have you know, a lot of books at home, right? They're less likely potentially to go to the library and kind of sit and read. They're more likely, and this was data that we had in one of our low-income communities. We were seeing this. They're more likely to sit and watch television as opposed to sit and read a book or have a book read to them at night, right? So they're knowing fewer words, and that impacts their reading level. So I know that I have freshmen who I work with in my program who are reading on a 5th or 6th grade reading level, right? And the teacher that I worked with, one of the teachers I worked with was like, oh my goodness, 6th grade is great, because when the school I came from, they're reading on a 3rd grade level, so at least they're a little bit better at this school, right? So they're knowing fewer words. They're more absent than their higher socioeconomic status peers for so many reasons. It can be things like they just don't feel like coming to school. They could be tired. They could, you know, not necessarily have anybody making them go to school. So we've got this idea of knowing fewer words. And to John's point, they're hearing fewer words, right? I mean, if my mom or my dad or my grandma is working all the time and they're not just sitting having conversations with me, or even if they are and they've grown up in poverty, I'm not hearing as many words. I'm not potentially hearing as, you know, the type of language I'm hearing is different, right? You know, Angie said she's got one of her dads is on a 3rd grade reading level. 3 of his children can read better than him, right? So if I'm that young person, I mean, my dad and I aren't having conversations that are going to push me academically. And I'm more absent than some of my peers. I mean, of course I'm going to be behind academically, right? Because I know fewer words, I'm more likely to be absent. I mean, it's just kind of this cycle that can be really destructive. This last piece is critical. They may not have a connection to their school. A connection to their school can be a variety of things. It can be being a part of a club. It can be being on a sports team. It can be having a teacher that you love and that, you know, always says hello to you every single morning. It can be having a class that you're really successful in and you really love, but it is just something that makes you feel like you are tied to your school. Research overwhelmingly tells us that students that do not have a connection to their school and are academically behind are more likely to drop out of high school. And this is, you know, there's some research from the Search Institute. They do a lot of research around like social emotional learning and young people. They have these 40 developmental assets that are really great if you ever want to look them up. But what the Search Institute says is that connection to the school can be very what they call kind of easy, right? So it can mean that if I'm at a middle or high school and I have a young person whose locker is close to mine, but they're not in my class, every day in the morning, I can just say, hey, Hillary, I hope you have a great day today. Hey, Hillary, how was your weekend? Hey, Hillary, anything going on with you? And if Hillary's gone from school for a few days, then when she gets back, I need to make a point to say, hey, Hillary, where have you been? I haven't seen you. Have you been sick? Are you okay? Because if I'm a young person who doesn't have a connection to my school, I'm potentially not doing well academically, so school just doesn't feel like a place I want to be. And if I'm absent for several days and the only thing that we get is the mandatory call from the school saying that I'm absent, I may not feel incredibly energized to go back to school, which again creates this cycle. And I did some research around education levels in West Virginia, and it looks like, you know, you've got higher rates in West Virginia of graduation rates, but not higher education attainment. And so, you know, I may graduate high school, I may not, but I'm certainly not energized to keep going to school. You know, if I've not been successful at something, I'm not sure why I would want to keep doing it, right? So Maureen says that she works at a juvenile detention school, and 45% have an intellectual deficiency diagnosis, which also exacerbates the situation, right? I mean, if I've got any sort of intellectual disability, ADHD, I mean, if I've got autism, my brother has autism, if I've got anything else going on, you know, it is just going to be significantly harder. You know, particularly if I'm like a larger student, like there's research around like the size of a young person, I may get suspended. And Maureen is seeing it. If I'm more likely to get suspended, I'm more likely to make a choice that's going to get me arrested. And John makes a really interesting point, and honestly, this was a question I had internally when I read the data, is, John says that, the state is lowering some of the requirements to graduate, and that data essentially tells that story. If you've got really, really high rates of graduation, but you don't have high rates of any sort of educational attainment after, that just tells a very interesting story, right? So Russell makes a point that is, so important, is that connection to school that I've talked about. So things like participation in sports and band is difficult for kids living in poverty. Transportation, I know where we live, we don't have reliable public transportation. And so for us, like, our kids really struggle with doing things after school. Fees, if I can't, I remember I cheered in high school. That is expensive, right? Fees and uniforms. We make it, he says it, we make it impossible. It is really hard for young people to do things after school. And I remember we had an after school club and we provided transportation, we gave them food, but some of them said, our older kids said, well, I have to go home and watch my siblings. I can't stay here after school, right? So 40%, less than 40% at this particular high school can read on grade level, less than 40%. If I can't read on grade level, what are the things that I'm going to be able to do after, right? What does college look like for me? What does a job look like for me? What does success look like for me, right? So we're going to move forward, and this was my slide. So children are more likely, who live in poverty, are more likely to display some of the following behaviors. You've seen them if you've worked with young people who are living in poverty. Acting out behaviors, sometimes this is attention-seeking behavior. Sometimes it is their amygdala going on overdrive, right? Impulsivity, that's amygdala-based behavior. They have a more of a limited range of behavioral responses, right? Because if I've not been taught or modeled certain things, like I just don't have them. Inappropriate emotional responses. One of the really fascinating things about this book is, and it was the first time I'd ever heard it, when I first read this book, is that when we come into the world as babies, we are programmed with 6 core emotions, and the research backs this up. So we have 6 emotions. 6, that's it. And I'm gonna try to quiz myself because I don't know where I flagged it, but it's sadness, joy, disgust, surprise, fear, and anger. So I'm gonna read them one more time. Sadness, joy, disgust, anger, surprise, and fear. Those are the only 6 that we have. And if no one else teaches us or models other behaviors like empathy and cooperation and gratitude, and forgiveness, humility, we don't have them. We only have the 6. Right? And of the 6, and again, I don't like to, when I'm talking to young people, I don't like to call emotions negative, but of those 6, the only one I'm excited about having is joy. That's about it. The rest of them I'm not really as excited about having. Also, I've told you that emotions, particularly those more negative emotions, they live in the amygdala, and the amygdala is bigger for young people who are living in poverty. One other thing I'll talk about with emotions, if you haven't seen the movie Inside Out, it's a Pixar movie, you should watch it. If you work with little kids, I utilize Inside Out as a way to teach them about their brains and their emotions. Inside Out is actually wildly accurate from a brain perspective. It has these 6 emotions. It has 5 of them. It doesn't have surprise, because I don't know how they would have a character be surprised for an entire movie. But in terms of the emotions, the memory, you will find on there that anger, the way that they communicate anger, is interesting because the research tells us that anger is a secondary emotion. So what that means is that there's something underneath anger. It is either sadness, frustration, shame. There's something underneath it, and that movie communicates that as well. So I always am giving homework because I'm forever a teacher. So one of your homework assignments is to watch Inside Out if you haven't already. Going back to our list, these students have gaps in social graces and politeness. Again, because if these things aren't taught or modeled for me and there's no sort of expectation for such things, then I just may not have it. And there's a thread that, I hope that you've gathered, that my goal here is not to beat up on low-income parents. My grandma, lived in poverty for much of her life until my dad and my brother moved up the income ladder, and so I believe to my core that people are doing the best they can with what they have, but if I've grown up in poverty and now I'm an adult, these are the things that are rooted in how I've grown up, and I just don't necessarily have the income to move out of poverty. So this is a video that we recorded this, and so Hillary can jump on and tell us where the recording will be, but I will make sure that this talk that I was going to show, I'll summarize it, that this talk is included in this, but it's a TED Talk, and I only show the first 5 minutes, but the TED Talk explains scarcity mindset. So if you have ever been really, really hungry, or if you have been very, very tired, you can understand what scarcity mindset means. And it is essentially when we have this huge need. And so for a lot of people in poverty, it is a need for more money, right? So that they can pay their bills and potentially move out of poverty. But it literally makes us have tunnel vision. And it's hard to see or process anything else going on because our brain is so hyper focused on whatever the next thing is. So if I am just starving, right? I'm so hungry. It's been hours and hours since my last meal, and I had a meeting, so I couldn't eat lunch, whatever the case may be. And I know that, that I'm either really hungry or that's coming. All I can think about is that next thing is eating. And so for folks who are living in poverty, they are often, almost all the time living with tunnel vision. It's the one next thing, right? I just got to focus on whatever the one next thing is. And so for young people, it can be hard for them to focus on, a lot of other things when they're just trying to focus on the next thing. We also sometimes see this with young people who, and we're going to talk about trauma in a second, who are living in foster care. They're just focused on whatever the next thing is because there's so much fluidity with them. And so I say that to say that scarcity mindset, it is sometimes frustrating for us when we're working with low-income people, and we're like, well, why didn't you think about, if you're working with them from a financial literacy standpoint, why didn't you think about the fact that you needed to save, this amount of money because you knew you were going to have this bill next month? And they're like, this thing was coming up tomorrow. I had to focus on that next thing, right? So my hope is that thinking about the scarcity mindset, if nothing else, can just kind of allow us to have a bit more grace. You know what I mean? So we've got a few more slides, and then I'll kind of hop back into the chat to look at some of our questions. So I often talk about trauma when I talk about poverty, and I want to say very clearly that every young person who is experiencing trauma is not in poverty, and every student in poverty is not experiencing trauma. So I want to just say that, off the gate. But what I also want to say is that there is often overlap. And since some of you are working with, young people who are homeless, young people who are in foster care, and those young people, they're experiencing trauma. So I just want to kind of hit on very quickly trauma, and also because it shows up similarly in the brain to poverty. So I just want to talk about that pretty quickly. So there are these adverse childhood experiences. Some of you may have heard of them. Some of you may not have. So if you have, this will be just a quick reminder. But adverse childhood experiences are these potentially traumatic experiences that happen to young people between 0 and 17, 0 to 18. It is really one of the ways in which we quantify and talk about trauma. I am doing a lot of research around trauma, specifically actually as it relates to youth in foster care. But what we know is that there are 10 experiences that if a young person has really 2 or more of these, and the research says the more of them that you have, the worse the outcomes will be, the harder their life will be. And again, this is how we quantify trauma. This image came from NPR, but the CDC really houses all of the adverse childhood experiences data. And I'll tell you very quickly, this came from a study out of Kaiser Permanente, the hospital system in California. There was a physician who was doing obesity research and realized that some of his patients were doing much better than others. Like they were, following the treatment plans, they were keeping the weight off longer. And so this physician was trying to figure out why some patients are doing better than others, and basically realized that it was because some of them were experiencing trauma while they were growing up, and that trauma just followed them. So the 10 are as follows. There's abuse, physical abuse, that a young person, again, this is 0 to 17, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. There's neglect, physical and emotional neglect. And then there are these household dysfunctions, so things happening within the household. Mental illness, seeing your mother treated violently, having divorce in your family, an incarcerated relative, or substance abuse, which I know in West Virginia that comes up a lot, is the substance abuse piece. So again, research will tell us the more of these you have, the longer the impacts are. I'm going to argue that depending on which one it is, it may be awfully bad. Our juvenile detention center here locally, their average ACE score for their students is 3.8. And so again, you just got a lot of young people experiencing trauma. So I'm going to quickly just talk about this so that I can make sure we end on time. So this again is from the CDC. They've got a slew of resources on adverse childhood experiences. But what we know is that adverse childhood experiences have a long-lasting impacts. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about trauma next week when we talk about teen pregnancy. But again, the more of these you have, the longer impacts and the more of these you have. So if you've got, one or more really, the data says 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, you're more likely to have injuries, traumatic brain injuries, fractures, and burns. You're more likely to have mental health issues. This thing here is super important in the context of this conversation. You're more likely to have unintended pregnancy complications, HIV and STDs, that I think matters to this group a lot, chronic disease later in life, risky behavior, alcohol and drug abuse, unsafe sex, which can lead to the unintended pregnancy, obviously, and then educational attainment, occupation, and income. And so I just want to, and this is the last slide before we kind of hit on questions and such, because the ACEs and trauma is a whole presentation in and of itself, but I just wanted to again hit on it because trauma impacts the brain almost the same way as poverty does, in the sense that if you got young people or adults who experience trauma when they grew up, you may see some of these same things. And what I don't want you to do is do an adverse childhood experience survey for your students. We don't do them for hours because really those surveys are done best in a clinical setting. So some of you probably are clinicians, because it might kind of bring up some past trauma. It may bring some stuff up, so don't do that, again, unless you're a clinician. But I just wanted to do an overview of trauma because some of you may have young people who are experiencing poverty, experiencing trauma, or both. ACEs, so again, adverse childhood experiences are common. About 61% of adults that the CDC surveyed across 25 states had experienced at least one type of adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 6 had reported 4 or more, right? And I'm telling you, like, these things follow you. So when I think about my dad, again, someone who grew up in poverty, based on just what he shared with me, I think he had 8 ACEs. ACEs, preventing ACEs could potentially reduce a large number of health conditions, because we've talked about the fact that ACEs have health implications, and so we can reduce them and prevent them. It can, have a positive impact in terms of our health. Some children are at greater risk than others, and it sounds like because you all have, these both pockets of poverty, and you have pockets of area within West Virginia that have high rates of drug abuse, you've got young people who are at more risk for adverse childhood experiences. And they're costly. There's an economic cost to families and to society, because again, there are health implications associated with this. So I just wanted to provide kind of a primer and introduction to ACEs. I'm happy to go more into depth at a future time talking about trauma, because like I said, I'm doing a lot of research on this right now, specifically in the context of youth and foster care. But I just wanted to provide an overview so that if you've gone through this whole presentation, you're like, well, I don't have any kids who live in poverty, but they all, they act this way. You may have kids who've experienced trauma. So this last slide that I'll go through, and I'll say it quickly, and potentially in a future presentation next week, really, we'll talk more about this. But the silver lining in all of this is that the brain is plastic. It is designed to change. It can change. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about some practical things that you can do if you're working with, specifically with mothers who are teen moms and teenagers who are pregnant, about what you can do. But, the thing I want you to walk away from is that these things can change and that the brain can change. So I'm going to leave this slide on while I just kind of hop in the chat function and see if there's anything that we kind of need to hit on very quickly, because I recognize it's 1:59. So if you've got to jump off, feel free to do that. I'm just going to answer a few questions. So Paul asked, what is the book that we were talking about, The 6 Emotions? That is the same guiding book, if you will, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, from Eric Jensen. So just get this book, and it's got so many things you need in it. Maureen said that she sees generational patterns in family who lack education or don't finish high school. They're more likely to live off welfare, because they need it financially, they view it as a paycheck or have this instilled idea that education is important. And there's so much, you know, tied into all of that and all of that belief. You can go to my website, as Hillary said. You can email me. I'll give you my email in just a second. Tanya says that they collect ACE scores at all their annual well child visits. That is huge. I mean, that is a really, really good thing that you all do that at a well child visit, because you all are really able to connect young people to resources. That's really, really encouraging to hear. I'd love to come to West Virginia when the world becomes less crazy. And Jamie, I'll push this presentation. I'll send it to the Hillary, and we can make sure that participants have it. Thank you, Russell. Trauma presents in kids symptomatically almost identically to ADHD. It's really interesting. So that's, again, something to think about as you're working with students. We'll go quickly through these. Nadine Burke, she's amazing. Go watch Nadine Burke's TED Talk. It's game changing. All right, seems like lots of just kind of additional comments. So I will pass it. It's 2 o'clock, so I'll pass it off to Hillary. And I don't have my email on here. What I'll do is just is Hillary, I think, can send it out to folks. But I'm happy to answer any additional questions that you have later on. And I hope that some of you will join next week when we talk specifically about teen pregnancy.
If you, does anyone have any questions? We can still have a few minutes, Jessica. Okay. Pop-ups up. If not, oh, you're on mute.
You know, I did just realize that, but I was like, what?
No.
Super important. I just said I saw the chat pulled up.
I'm so happy that you have joined us. I wish I could have brought you here, and I will one day bring you to West Virginia.
One day, I'd love to come visit.
We are going to hang out. But I have greatly enjoyed this. Everything about the brain I find fascinating, but you know, West Virginia poverty is a huge part of our general lifestyle. So I was super excited about what you put together. I appreciate you, and I can't wait for next week's presentation. Everybody who's online right now, I hope you join us again next week.
And Kelly asked, will you all receive a link? Will you send out a link for next week's training?
Yes. If you got an email about this week's training, it was probably included with that, but we will send the same one out. So there will be another link for next week as well. So you can also look on Mission's Facebook page and get a link for that. We'll have that up. If you've attended any of our other webinars, I'm still working on getting things sent out from that. I've had a little bit of family crisis over the past couple of weeks. My dad got very sick and passed away, so I apologize. If anyone here has not gotten their information yet, I'm back to work. We are rolling now, so I'll get all of that out to everyone from our past 2 webinars as well. Jessica, thank you for sharing all of your information and your knowledge. Are there any questions from anybody?
And feel free to send me an email. I'll type my email in here quickly. But I hope to see you all next week.
Yay. Oh, wait, somebody said I rock. Who was that? Because I love you.
It's Dorothy that said that you rock.
Oh, Dorothy. Thank you. She works with us. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much, Jessica. I'm so happy to finally meet you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Next week, if you need anything from me, shoot me a message and let me know. Okay.
All right, we'll talk next week, y'all.